Thank you very much for inviting us to talk today. I'm Rhianne Jones and I'm with Bill Thompson, and we both work in research and development. Bill is a program lead and he's heading up some really exciting new work around sort of new approaches to data stewardship and what this might enable in terms of the creation of new forms of public value. And I lead a work stream that is focused on questions more specifically related to public values, privacy and ethics in relation to the design, development of data-driven systems and their wider use and implications in society. So our talk today is on doing data right. And I think the first thing to probably say is that there's no clear answer. These are really complex challenges. And our work is very much about thinking through these challenges, and not just conceptually, but really importantly, how we can sort of push forward practical responses that might scale in practice. So just to set the scene, while obvious, it's still very important to state data-driven technologies are fundamentally changing our media landscape at pace and at scale and in a variety of different ways. And it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that data now extends into every single part of media, from production to distribution to audience experiences. And generally speaking, the availability of its data and the use of data promises a lot, from better ways to assess problems, to supporting decision-making in organizations, to even automating processes where appropriate. And the right data at the right time and handled responsibly presents huge opportunities for new insight and innovation. So, at the BBC, effective use of data is increasingly at the heart of our plans for making the most of opportunities from digital and online and all the internet has to offer. And it's fair to say that the BBC has been operationally working with data for quite a long time now to do a variety of different things, from managing network performance to creating programme listings and analysing broadcast output to make sure that it's operating well. And of course, sort of gaining insight into audiences, which we've been doing for decades. But uses of personal data specifically are clearly significant and growing. And we're using them to do a variety of different things, from driving recommendations and discovery services to tailor learning experiences on things like bite size, and even to think about more future-orientated forms of media like object-based media, where effectively we treat media like objects that are described by data so they can be more flexibly rearranged or customized, as well as knowing about things like home setups for orchestrated devices or even edge computing further down the line. And at the moment, we have a privacy promise that lays out our current approach to sort of data. But just to zoom out for a moment, public media, its role and its values are a cornerstone of democracies and have long been part of healthy information ecosystems all around the world. But as our media landscape transforms, how we collectively agree and embed our public values, specifically when it comes to data and technology, has often struggled to keep pace with that change. And we recognise this challenge. How we do data right is not just about sort of policies or engineering. These are really cross-cutting social, cultural, and technical challenges, and the added element of establishing a public service perspective on top of all of this. And one of the biggest challenges I think we face is how to manage and steward data responsibly, to bridge our aspirations to be able to sort of share data for either personal or public benefit, with the very valid concerns at the moment around privacy and harms to individuals and communities and society at large that can emerge when there's sort of misuse with data. And luckily right now, there are lots of people working on responses to this. And in BBC R&D, we've been interested in this topic for some time now. For those of you who might be less familiar with R&D, we conduct research and development into media and communications technologies in the public interest as part of our mandate under the Charter. We're a department of around probably 200 plus experts in engineering, design, research, data science. And on a day-to-day basis, we work quite closely with the wider tech division and editorial and legal and policy at the BBC. And in terms of our function, really, it's more about horizon scanning. So we probe technical futures and public service drivers for technical innovation and change. And we work with others to add tangible value to media and creative industries and the wider UK economy. And a key area of what we do is how public service organisations can use data and increasingly personal data responsibly. So since around 2018, we've been looking into alternative models for data stewardship. Now, I can't go into too much detail, but simply speaking, when I say alternative, it's just a signal that it's different to what happens now, whereby companies collect and centrally store and are responsible for managing data about us and who has access to it. And in this context, we tend to have very little sale control over this and very little oversight as well. So through our data stewardship work, we're exploring how we can better balance access to data with this need for sort of privacy protection, as well as how we might embed new sorts of mechanisms that can better support people in having more of an active sort of say in how data about them might be used. And we see our role as helping to explore, understand, develop, and even test the potential and the limits of these approaches as part of this sort of growing effort that we're seeing. And our work is not just technical, we should probably say that. We've conducted several studies over the last couple of years into public attitudes to data, sort of criteria for sort of trust in data management, and their views towards these sort of alternative approaches as well. We found a genuine concern amongst the public around how data is being collected and used. But I think most interesting for us is this appetite we found, where people are really quite thoughtful in their engagement around these discussions about alternatives. In one example, when we ran a national survey last year and we showed people a range of different alternatives, the sort of status quo was ranked the lowest, and it was quite clear that there was an appetite for these approaches that tend to give greater oversight and greater levels of control over personal data when combined with things like good security assurances and accountability measures. So one specific area we've explored in more detail is the idea of personal data stores. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Bill to tell you a bit more about our work.
Thanks ever so much, Rhi. And I hope that's given people just a sense of sort of what we're particularly interested in and why we're looking in this area. As Rhi said, so one of the more interesting approaches to looking after people's data better is this thing called the personal data store, sometimes called a personal data service. And it's worth noting that it's the data store that's personal, not the data. That you can keep any data you want in a PDS. It's a personal data store. And I think it's an unfortunate term in that sense, because people hear personal data and think it's referring to personal data. Obviously, the idea of having a cryptographically secure lock has been around for a very long time. And there are lots and lots of different approaches to this, different ways of storing and providing access to the data, and lots of different business models, people trying to make money out of this or trying to do it in the public interest, not make money out of it. What they have in common is they give a place to keep data safe and a way of allowing applications to use that data. So names like Databox and Solid, Midex, HAT, the hub of all things, Digime, Blockstack, they're all out there, and many of them you can work with. In our research, we've been working with Databox and more recently with Solid. And if you can pull up the next slide, please, Rhi. So that's 3 years ago now, we started work on a prototype that was built using a platform called Databox. Databox was an EPSRC funded project from 2016, led by Imperial College London, University of Cambridge and Nottingham, along with the BBC, BT, Microsoft Research and Telefonica. So a number of people exploring how data could be stored safely. And the core principle behind Databox is that data is not only stored, but also processed in user space. That is, it's not the case that you just have a secure repository of your data and then you hand it over to someone to process and trust them to delete it when they finish with it. With Databox, you end up creating a complete operating environment within which user processes and data were co-located. And then you implement a very strong, provably secure method of controlling data moving into and out of that environment. So that allows you to ingest some data, to process it, and then in a controlled way to share the results of that processing without ever exposing the raw data itself. And this is a project that we helped develop and we did a number of experiments with. One was a living room of the future, where your data about your media preferences was stored in a data box in the living room. And when you walked into a room, you identified yourself and the lighting would go to the right level and your favorite television program would come on. But none of the data leaked out. It was not available to third parties for processing. The BBC box, which you can see illustrated, was another experiment set in an imagined future. And this was one in which your data store was on a physical box in your living room again. So we actually built a wooden box, put a Raspberry Pi in it running Databox, gave it some LEDs so it looked pretty, and built a set of web apps around it. You turn it off, your data is no longer visible on the network. How could it be? It's not actually got any power. The system we built allowed you to log into the Databox and ingest your data from BBC iPlayer and also from Spotify. And it generated, it had an app to generate a user profile of you that indicated your media preferences without revealing exactly what you might be watching or listening to. and then allowed you to export that profile in a controlled way to another app we built, a very simple recommender. Well, calling it a recommender was perhaps an overstatement. We built an app that selected from an inventory of BBC content, BBC programs, and local events, and allowed you to view the content in a mock-up of BBC iPlayer. And it was a good system. It allowed us to do live demonstrations, but it was a standalone technical demonstrator. And we used it to impress people, to show and hint at some of the possibilities that could come if you had a cross-service media recommender. And it encouraged us enough, the feedback we got from the few people we showed it to and from the work we did internally, to want to move on and do something more substantial. And for that, we started using a system called Solid. Could you have the next slide, please, Rhi? So Solid is, we've used to build a fully working prototype that we've just evaluated as part of a closed trial. The name Solid comes from social linked data. It's a set of standards proposed towards the World Wide Web Consortium, developed by Tim Berners-Lee, who you may have come across before. He invented this thing called the World Wide Web. And a Solid implementation lets people store their data securely in decentralized data stores that they call pods. So a pod is a secure personal web store. As with other data stores, any kind of data can be stored in a Solid pod. You control access to the data in your pod, decide what to share and with whom, and applications use standard protocols to do that. And then you build something called a Solid server, which hosts lots of pods, and the pods are made available to individuals. It's a fairly straightforward structure. You can store any kind of data in a pod, but it gets interesting when you store linked data there, because linked data starts to create the web of data and hints towards the vision of the semantic web and provides for interoperability, so that different applications can easily access the same data because it self-identifies, and therefore you can reduce duplication and allow services to work together. So you don't need to input data into, for example, forms in the same way. It's building the sort of model we see already where passwords and other things are stored in applications, but doing it in a way which, again, Tim said, is supposed to be interoperable and hints towards an interoperable web of data. Our working system shows that secure data can be held privately in a PDS and then used along with aggregate non-personal data, in our case, listings data, to deliver new media services, or we believe to enhance existing media services. And we just finished doing a trial. The results of that will be out later in the year, and obviously we'll be sharing them. Could I have the next slide, please, Rhi? What our work with Databox and then with Solid leads us to is a model of something we call the public service data ecosystem. So the idea is to think of the components that would work together to provide a secure and effective platform for public service applications, where you can mix together personal and private data with open data, with aggregate data, with data from IoT devices, your thermostat, your car, whatever it might be, in an overall environment where trust is at the core, interoperability is paramount, and you can start building new flexible services that people might want to embrace. So the three elements that you can see there are firstly a place to securely store personal data stores, one per person or hundreds per person, a data exchange of some sort that allows access to aggregate and open and licensed non-personal data. And you can see from the diagram that data sources can populate both the personal data store, I might use GDPR to ask for something, or populate the aggregate data store. It might be non-personal data that's coming from a source like an open source. There's then the opportunity to build services on top of those many different types of data that allow you to offer personalized services, recommendations, other things we haven't thought of, media profiles, health profiles, fitness. Basically, at this point, it's an environment within which you can have, as an application developer, access to people's data and to aggregate data and use your imagination. And what we believe is this model will create a greater trust environment for the users who will be much more willing to sign up for services when they know their data can't be abused. That's what we're trying to find out with our research, whether this actually does make a difference. What we've done so far is prove that we can build the thing and it works technically. We've built an end-to-end solution. And so the idea would be that a personal data store sits at the center of this wider system that delivers the benefits of the data economy, but allows people to feel more confident that they know where and how their data is being used. And we're putting this forward as a way of thinking about how we could do data differently in ways that will not just be beneficial for the BBC as a public service broadcaster, but for any organization that wants to deliver public value, that's not just concerned with either advertising models or its bottom line. We think it's also a useful way of delivering some legal requirements. Under GDPR, for example, things like data portability, deleting user data on request become a lot easier because the organization that's running the apps and services never has the personal data in the first place. All that needs to happen is for the user to delete it. So that's where we are at the moment. That's the work we've been doing. We're still at the early stages of this journey, but we think that, public media like the BBC, we have to continue to innovate and work with others to imagine and build and execute on a vision for a healthy media environment. We believe this is one aspect of that. Thank you.